countries being working, the government, the central government and the municipality and the Port Authority, the Las Americas Port Authority, are being working in the development of the Port of the Americas, which is a major investment. It's a $250 million of investment in developing a port, which is being adapting particularly to changes in terms of the port activity, the global port activity, and that it's something that will be affecting the capacity of the city in order to respond to that growth. So in order to prepare the city for that impact that we expect in the next 10, 15, and next 20 years, the city has to prepare in terms of how we understand density, how can we reprogram density, not just density in terms of built area, but density in terms of how you program a city, how you can mix uses, how you can actually create exchanges, untraditional exchanges in terms of how you mix those uses. So during this semester, we've been dealing with that, particularly two of the studios are being working with sites, major boulevards that we think are the appropriate places for actually rethink the capacity of how we reprogram density. And particularly this panel, we would like to address, not just in the case of Puerto Rico or just the case of Ponce, but globally, how we understand density and how can we feedback the city and the architects, the planners in Puerto Rico about how we have to define density in our planning efforts.
At the AA, we believe in a kind of approach which is about collective design, and we try to operate in a way to try to speculate about how computation could allow us to evolve a project that I think has been really in formation since the early 50s, which is these kind of larger visionary speculations about how urbanism, architecture, and even the processes of production could be actually conceived, implemented, and developed through an attitude which is more speculative, coherent. And one of the arguments that we try to make is that computation is really our ability to detail and to work through the management of density, the problems of architecture, and with a certain understanding that there's an attitude towards latency and the unknown. If you can imagine here a slide of Tokyo Bay in the 60s. The 60s in particular had a very interesting attitude to these visionary plans. Someone like Kenzo Tange, he had an idea of the city post-war and tried to develop a city for 5 million. And so he proposed this attitude for a new city. And it was very spirited in a certain sense and symptomatic, I think, of a lot of the projects of the early 60s to 70s, which was really trying to look at the discourse of the city, of urbanism, of living, and to sort of propose a sort of future that was quite optimistic, quite forward-thinking, technologically driven, but problematic, because the tools and the ways of thinking still conform to a kind of attitude which was very much about master planning. And the idea of negotiating or even trying to deal with this kind of attitude of developing a project for 5 million people in one sort of plan is something where the magnitude and the complexity of architecture in the city cannot be meant to be coped with. But what started to actually happen in the late 60s, early 70s that started to change that, I think, was this introduction of computation. You had radical experiments like Nicholas Negroponte starting something like the Architecture Machine Group, which was really a pure speculation about how new tools could sort of change the idea of what the architect could be. And there was a novelty into that, and there was a sort of attitude at MIT in the 70s which was really about asking questions about how this could refigure or reconstruct. And I think this was kind of really important because the Architecture Machine Group was really a 10-year experiment. You guys may know this more from what it's known as today as the New Media Lab, or the Media Lab of MIT. And the questions of architecture, which were fundamental and sort of moved towards these ideas of communication and information, started to shift the architectural problem. And we saw this kind of attitude with a lot of the designs that were going on from people that were thought about as almost like anti-architects. And so you had this agenda for people to try to talk about how people could participate and engage with the city. What's interesting about that period was that there was also no real clear distinction between disciplines. I think a lot of the most interesting work was interdisciplinary by choice, with the idea that, for example, at the same time that Negroponte is working, you had people like Grigori Kepes trying to bring people like Buckminster Fuller, Norbert Wiener, all these people into a conversation that extended between the disciplines of art, design, engineering. And so you had this kind of very creative friction that was trying to tease out and ask kinds of new questions. And I think, at least in the work that we've been trying to develop, we've been trying to actually think what's actually different today. We've witnessed over the last 10 years the demands of countries that are basically asking architects to design new cities, but with a kind of an accelerated urbanism, which had the same problematics of a lot of those megastructures projects, but actually with a time frame that was almost unprecedented. If you look at the development in Shanghai, China, there was this kind of demand for architects, and computation became an interesting tool, I think, for us to work on. So a lot of the things that we've been speculating on was how to deal with this kind of uncertainty and to challenge the issues of conventional master plan by actually allowing computation to bridge not just organizations at the scale of the city, but also a certain attitude to how we can continue to evolve those principles at the scale of the buildings, the building blocks, and even to question materiality. And this gives us a very particular access. And through that, I think it becomes an interesting way of dealing with density. Because density, for example, is not a really very particular given. And a lot of the discussions around computation seem to be argued through the sort of demand that we're trying to control everything, which seems to be a bit of an illusion. I mean, control is an illusion from the architectural perspective, but we try to find ways that in which we can actively participate. And so we try to develop systems that some people will call parametric, other people would call generative, trying to look and think about computation as a way of thinking about knowledge, and to allow this kind of information exchange to start to shape about what a sort of future speculation of the city is. The future that I'm talking about is not the 60s future. In the 60s, everybody was talking about almost a vision which was a sort of utopia. I think the practice of today makes certain demands, which is more about trying to establish ways of asking different questions and enabling a different kind of conversation on the subject. And through that, I think this also changes the role of the architect as an individual more in terms of a collective. And I think these are things that I share with my colleagues, and also with the role of how students also participate in this. Because I think one of the things that should be understood is that the education of the architect is not really a training ground for where practice and education will find itself as two very different sort of ideas of knowledge. What's actually happening is that if you consider design and architecture, we don't actually have things like a prototype. We don't iteratively kind of go through a certain way of testing. We go really from design to production in almost very unique settings. And I think this has also been very symptomatic of actually how we see the world today, which is very much about the values of the generic. And you see this kind of almost like copy-paste sort of attitude of sprawl and of city development, which actually is kind of goes against about all of those contextual parameters. And what we're kind of arguing is not a kind of accelerated way of doing that using computers, so that somehow this is more for the developer, but actually to be able to use computation as a way to think about how people could actually start to evolve these things. As the city is a constant evolving element, the ambitions, the desires through that, I think, have to be inbuilt with that. And so with that respect, I think what we've been trying to do is speculate and to use a kind of discourse that has been involving, I think, a lot of experimental architecture schools like SciArc, Architectural Association, and to think about the role of how the students actually are really much part of the much bigger research project, which is a kind of call to arms for architects really to engage with the problems of today. And in doing so, you sort of tease out a very different idea of complexity, which is as much about communication as the introduction about living systems and the built environment. So the students' role, and I think one of the things that we've started to see is that they are not necessarily burdened by the problematics of building in a traditional sense or the complexities of clients and governments. And so in a certain way, they cut through all of the BS that usually starts to complexify and make things very political and difficult to actually really address what are the problems of today. And so with the tutors and with students, I think, and having events like this, they become forums at least to be able to engage people and try to come to terms with the challenges. And so, for example, what does it actually mean to develop a situation here that's different from New York or London, which we operate? And the belief is, anyway, that if we allow things to sort of evolve, and I keep talking about computation because I feel like that's the difference of today, where we can actually speculate with tools that will allow people to collectively actually operate, work, manage, and construct. We start to see that we also don't have that divide between design and make, where we are much more in control of actually dealing with the processes of sort of looking and reinvesting in forms of production, which would actually work towards making things more unique, culturally relevant. And so there is an interesting moment where the novelties of a lot of that speculative problems of the 60s, I think, is starting to come into a maturity where we're at the moment able to start to think about those more visionary ways of thinking about the city and the future in a much more practical sense.
One thing I'm interested in my office is the issue of energy, and if that has anything to do with architecture and design or not. And I think it's an ongoing discussion in my office, but also I think out in the world, as people talk more about sustainability and try to grapple with what that means for design. It's not clear what it means for design. People speak of it as if it automatically means something for design, but it's not clear and it needs to be figured out. I think that's our job to do it as architects, not as engineers necessarily. I think we need to figure that out. But I think the question with that is, will issues of energy, I think they will, have a substantial impact not only on urbanism, which I think goes without saying that they will, but also on architectural design for cities. And what happens when you begin to think of energy not as something that supplies cities, but as something that's embedded or integrated in cities? When you create density and a skyline in a city, that one of the most important issues for me anyway is that we don't understand it as a skyline or as a series of icons in a city. And I think the great negative example of that is Dubai, where that's pretty much, you know, what you see is what you get from an airplane, let's say, or from a ship out in the ocean. And it's a series of building objects which are intended to be viewed from miles and miles away. And so the city becomes an object to be, you know, liked or disliked, an object of art, I guess. And I guess what I worked on with my students was trying to think, well, wait a minute, what could a vertical building be like when we consider the street level intensively, when we consider the spaces that you can create within a building, or by starting to delaminate skins of a building and create microclimate spaces or in-between spaces. But I guess, you know, most importantly, how can you bring the city, into the building and activate buildings? And I think that leads to ideas that, you know, monofunctionality is not a model for the future. This is obviously not a new idea, but the realities of development tend to create monofunctionalism. So I think mixing it up in terms of what's going on in buildings is very important. Even in a dormitory, which was our program this semester with the students, I think it's really critical to consider ways into that discussion. And in the end, I'm trying to create microclimates which have a real effect on the lifestyle of the people living in the buildings at a very close level, a tactile difference. A spatial difference, and something that can kind of change the way you think and the way that you live. I think that's for me absolutely critical when you're talking about vertical development, is how do you interface the city, especially at the street level, but also how do you bring the street inside. So
this is a little bit of like the topic of what we took with our students to try and deal with density, understand that density is about certain critical mass, and it's about certain mass that produces a certain critical view, about things, and this you can take from cultural standpoint. The US is an interesting example of that. The kind of shift between cities and rural areas, goes from like, ideology all the way to like the basic understanding of life, and but it's very clear where we stand from and where we stand for here. So I think the idea of living in cities, the idea of like producing a friction, even at the kind of most fundamental stage, when it comes to a certain size of building, has something to do with the quantity, and this is what density refers to, but I think it has to do with intensity, meaning how all these issues begin to coalesce to produce something more than just, putting people together, but to begin to produce a kind of added value. And I think this is what architects can weigh in and add value in a way that is completely different, let's say, that density understood as a sort of negative thing, which is a kind of traditional aspect of it. I think density is about certain centrality and central proximity, and this is something that we value a lot in our work, and I would say it's sort of fundamental, the idea of how you begin with like some of those interactions, some of those frictions, and you begin to produce something that is not just quantitative, but is qualitative. It begins to actually add spatial, material, aesthetic qualities to those spaces that begin to resonate, from the body all the way to the senses, and begin to completely, I will argue, from the point of view of an architect, from the point of view of maybe like discrete buildings, whether they be small or large, whether it be like, in the center of a city or they'll be outside, whether it be a competition in Korea, or it be a building in South America, whether it be a small renovation on Los Angeles or something in Europe, that there's something at stake about like conceiving an architectural project around topics of human interaction and density, and then moving from there all the way to the the formal, the spatial, the material, the tectonic aspect of what can be done, that completely and radically changes things, the way we kind of perceive and relate to space.
What will be your, I would say, your understanding on how the architect has to engage socially, politically, and economically in order to transcend or shift the predominant paradigm of how we understand density?
Well, I mean, I think you're obviously at the city level, and I'm not an expert by no means, I'm not an urbanist. There's obviously certain things that come like prepackaged, and we have to operate within them. City codes, city planning, zonifications, and so on. It's not something that architects or like, say, people like us, or at least I speak for myself. We don't tend to even like approach that problem as something we can really change, because it will take a complete different mindset and approach. But I think, in my experience, it's more a question of like what you can do when a certain demand is either given to you or it's sort of in the air, and you're able to like, just catch it, and it's sort of like just catching the wave or like putting yourself into orbit. And I think in the beginning it takes a little bit of like just adjusting yourself to that sort of real, quote unquote, and then begin to try and like shift it around, move it, like like moving the cattle around, like where you really have to put yourself in the mat, and then like, to try and like dominate and move the forces where you want them to be, supposedly not for selfish, maniacal reasons, but because you're really trying to do something better. And I think, it goes to fundamental aspects of how to convince somebody that they should do, mixed use. And then there is an added value to that, or to convince somebody that maybe pushing the building volume to a kind of maximum size is not necessarily the most interesting thing to do.
How computation can help us, or how any examples that you can talk to us in how to retrofit or reprogram not just density, but the notion of time in the planning process of our cities.
Like this was the 60s idea of what a very optimistic, speculative idea of a future city would be, right? This is Kenzo Tange trying to do 5 million people.
5 million.
5 million people, which at the time was pretty much, the speculation was that Tokyo would go from 5 million to 10.4. And so Tange basically proposed this as a way to cope with those demands. The issue of time, I think, is critical. And I also think that we have to be very conscious of the kind of radicality of the time we're living in. I don't think it's an option in terms of addressing more time-based, I think what Tom was talking about in terms of the demands of trying to re-speculate on the notions of ecology, the notions of what sustainability really is, because at the moment we're sort of trivializing the problems, or we sort of throw our hands up to the complexities of the issues that are around us. You start to see in more traditional ways of thinking about the city, we get a vision, and then there's this process of trying to implement it. And I think Marcelo was bringing up the point of how slow architecture is. Maybe this is a virtue. In comparison to basically everything else has accelerated in such a way that it doesn't really offer us much form of reflection. So in one way, there is this kind of idea where we can start to think about still having that visionary approach and the materiality issues, the ways that we make things. You talk about programming, and I think that word today has to be really interrogated, because it's not just an issue of talking about what school or home or what those things actually are as generic features, but actually trying to embed that within the way that we live and the certain kind of attitudes that are really much more a part of the everyday. So I think in some level, computation sort of cuts through a lot of this, because it allows us access to rethink, let's say, issues of, for example, on-site materiality, instead of shipping things from all parts of the world. It allows us to think about materials not as something that's passive or inert, but they go through phase changes, they have different forms of application, and you see that changing the automobile industry, it's changing different forms of products, but when it comes to architecture, there seems to be a very passive idea of what architecture should be. And I think one of the things about trying to tease out new questions about it is to allow this thing to actually kind of evolve through, I think, a kind of interrogation of what that means today. In the 60s, all of those guys left architecture. Like Negroponte talks about laptops right now. He has the $100 laptop kind of agenda. And so we saw this communication technology change the world, and I think what we left behind was the real power that the built environment actually has, and it's a time-based and evolving environment, and we just want to be able to understand it on the terms that it demands. And this is, I think, why this is really a collective project. As much as we discuss the individual aspirations of an architect, I think there's a much bigger movement right now. And open source and all of these other aspects are really starting to stimulate a certain form of innovation that's allowing kids to actually really participate just as much as we are, and to develop kind of projects and technologies like this that gives us kind of direct access to be able to engage this in a better way, or a more intelligent way.
Tom, do you think there is you have during the last 15 years you've been working either in the US, Europe, Asia, what will be what are being your different expositions to the notion of cultural notions of density and the I would say the different notions of density in different parts of the world will affect your work. It's been affecting the way you approach your work. Is your work being informed by those notions of how, I will say, China or either Austria where you work or the US? Are those notions really affects the way your work is developed in terms of the proposals?
Of density?
Of density, yeah.
Well, I don't know. Yeah, I mean, certainly, having lived in Europe, you know, it's a certain kind of a humanist way of living, and I don't mean that in a bad way. There's a certain respect and understanding of how large groups of people can live together in an environment together, and what scale things need to be for the human. Scale of streets is different, the scale of cars is different, the scale of home appliances is different, scale of apartments, and those kinds of things that have been sort of tested and vetted over thousands of years, I guess, can create a certain kind of urban environment that you don't have in other places, where those things haven't sort of been done and redone thousands of times. And like in a place like China, I guess I have some concerns over there when I'm over there, and it really has to do with taking what I see as some of the worst things and really dated things, as you were saying. I think as you were saying, really dated ideas about what should drive development, and they tend to be very top-down kinds of issues. They tend to involve thinking about the automobile, which at this point is a really bizarre way to be making our future, which is based on the automobile. And I'm not talking about little smart cars or city cars. I'm talking about like a traditional automobile. So they're planning based on the car. They're planning based on lots of asphalt, huge roads, massive setbacks. Like some of the developments I've worked on there, 50-meter setbacks from a major road all over a whole district, which is a city killer. And I think it's a shame to see where development is happening the fastest. That they're working from the wrong models, the things which are not contemporary. And so in terms of my own work there, I think it's a real conundrum for architects working in places also where there is low density. It's where it's a given, and I thought it was interesting what Marcelo said, that in a way, if you're invited to come and make a proposal for a project, and also I do a lot of competitions, you're not in a situation, or let's say that's not the right venue to question at the root, the issues of zoning or height limits or whatever. Usually you've got to make a proposal within those limitations. If you break the limitations, you're out. So that's probably not the right venue. There are probably better venues for going at those issues. But it's actually quite difficult to do good design work sometimes and interface with the city when you've been pushed so far away, from pedestrians and from your building basically is forced into becoming an icon instead of something that's more urban. And I find that a lot. I mean, more and more we're doing projects that the thing is an island in itself, but it's in the middle of the city. And now, something I'm working on most recently in China, all the politicians are telling me that the first ring, the second ring, the third ring, the fourth ring are all so dense now, meaning bad, that now they're moving to the fifth ring. And what that's turning into is sprawl.
Well, yeah.
Right?
Agree, totally.
Yeah. And what they don't like about
it's a dense sprawl.
Yeah, it's a dense sprawl. But I mean, one of the issues there is that what they're really talking about, if you ask them, is they don't like the traffic of the automobiles. And I get that. But then you've got to go at that problem, and just expanding another ring is going to actually increase the problem of the automobile. So I think I guess there's a bit of a warning there, I also think that speaks for more international conferences and things on city planning and talking to people about more contemporary models of development, especially in developing countries. I think it's really critical because they're the ones now who are maybe not using the resources at the scale that we are in Western cities. But if you project into sprawl cities being built all over India and China and a lot of developing countries, it actually it creates a massive imbalance in energy and in global stability, frankly. So I think it's actually an imperative that we take these issues on.
Actually, in here we've been dealing in different levels, particularly the last 10 years. We've been challenging with the revitalization of the urban centers. I mean, the same thing. I mean, there was a moment in which the automobile culture after the Second World War became like the paradigm of how you actually transport yourself into the city. So we shift from a collective system, transport system, to an individual system, and that really affects the urban centers. The public policy after 2001, it's been how can we actually engage into redeveloping and revitalizing the urban centers. But when you get to the point of how you densify the urban center, is a great challenge. because then it gets to the point of how you define the equation in how you densify in there.
Yeah.
And the problem is how you define that equation, and the notion that that equation is static in time. They define it in 2001 or they define it in 2002, and then there's a decade with many changes in terms of, I mean, and we experience it. I mean, 2001 events, the financial crisis, many things has happened, and then revitalizing, it's an issue, but then redefining the notion of how we densify activity, it's another problem.
Yeah.
And I think computation and the notion of sound, how can we create that dynamic way of understanding and actualizing density in an active way, actually can give us a more, I will say, feasible way on how to densify not just the built environment, but the software of the city.
What is the role of the architect right now when you have phenomenons like open sourcing, where the democratization of the technologies and also models of living and thinking becomes a way that overexpose the idea of the democratization of space. What is the role of the architect right now within this aspect?
From my perspective, I'd say, because I think we're talking about a couple of different things, and there's the assumption that computation allows us to have a more democratic process. I think this is not necessarily the case. I think we're just at the infancy of this, and we should sort of understand this before we sort of relegate computation and the progress of the last like 50 years into this domain of discussing architecture and architects through the kind of history of failures. I think this is kind of symptomatic about how we evaluate things, and I think this goes back to the issue of time. Time allows some of these alternative models to actually reintroduce a difference, and we see that in all kinds of forms. And for me, open source is interesting because there are many open source users, right? That's very different from those people that are participating and really are trying to contribute a kind of knowledge that will allow, or at least give us the potential to actually do something. And for me, that means participate. For whatever that actually means, I think it's not necessarily just about talking about what my vision is. I'm not talking about collective, like all of a sudden we're in some kind of mono mentality. I actually think that the collective celebrates difference and diversity. Excellent. As soon as you start to really engage that, you start to begin the process of actually having a conversation about issues and trying to understand the complexities at hand. So there's a misrepresentation at times when we look at a lot of this stuff as form or formation and just speculated on the fact that this in some sense means that we're talking about a bioorganic future or something like this. Though I think we have some kinds of aspirations in that, of course, and there is a kind of sensibility of form because we actually think that this is also very powerful. There are much more deep-rooted questions about living, about what the city will be. And sometimes it can be as simple as like someone like Hugh Ferris is a critical figure about sort of illustrating an alternative. And you know, we were talking about the issue about code and implementation. Yeah, these are all part of actually constructing something, but I just think the architect at the moment is seen as someone who's quite passive, that basically his ability is only to service. And I think it's also part to communicate also and propose and to challenge actually the existing things, because we don't really have it right now, right? Everybody can agree that things are not perfect, things are kind of falling apart, and what's being introduced at the moment is actually an ultra-conservative idea of sort of going back into sort of models that make us feel comfortable because of a kind of relationship that we think we have with them. But times change, and I think we just have to be able to sort of engage and participate in trying to figure out a better way. So for those people that actually do believe in sort of putting their work out there to allow other people to enable them to have direct access to things, I think, yes, this is democratic. This is actually part of the future because you allow people to actually develop the knowledge to participate. And without that, if they don't have the tools to be able to engage the conversation, everything is deemed abstract. These architectural projects seem like they are, you know, anomalies and could never actually be realized with the demands of today. And I think we just have to move away from the sort of trivial ways of interpreting and ask tougher questions about how this stuff and how the existing condition could start to be much more proactively engaged. And I'm saying that because I think with open source, there is a bit of a promise in there and possibility, and I think it's getting nurtured. And you see the young kids that we saw yesterday, you know, there's desire, and they have much more capacity than, let's say, I do, to really be able to deal and manage that, because it's part of their world as much as it is part of our transitional world of, you know, thinking about what a drawing is, or even contemplating these kinds of issues. So I think that we're just at the beginning, and we shouldn't sort of try to terminate and evaluate a process while it's in formation. And if you look at the history of every sort of influential architect, if you talk about someone like Mies, he was always talking about the epoch, and he says the danger is when you define it, you know that it's over and it's time to move on. And I think this is what's actually happening at the moment. People are too quickly trying to assess things without allowing this stuff the time to evolve and to really contribute to sort of an alternative to what we know. This is my little spiel.
Well, thank you. I think it's been very enlightening for all of us.